What if one of the most important links inside a nuclear power's military could be disrupted without a single fighter jet crossing the border? Not a missile strike, not a large bombing campaign, just a coordinated wave of relatively inexpensive drones reaching hundreds of kilometers into enemy territory. If that sounds impossible, think again, because one of the biggest changes in modern warfare may not be happening on the front lines at all. It may be happening deep inside military infrastructure that most people have never even heard of. When people think about military strength, they usually picture tanks rolling across open fields, fighter jets racing through the sky, or massive naval fleets projecting power across oceans. Those images still matter, but they no longer tell the whole story. Modern wars are increasingly decided by something far less visible: the ability to connect information, command forces across enormous distances, and keep highly specialized systems functioning under constant pressure. That is why recent long-range drone operations have attracted so much attention from military analysts around the world. The immediate damage visible in satellite imagery may only represent a small part of the larger picture. The more significant question is whether repeated strikes against critical military infrastructure can slowly erode capabilities that take decades to build, but cannot be restored overnight. One category of infrastructure receiving renewed attention is strategic military aviation. Unlike tactical aircraft that operate directly above the battlefield, these platforms perform missions that support an entire military system. Some coordinate surveillance over enormous regions. Others relay communications to forces operating far beyond conventional radio range. Their value is measured less by the weapons they carry than by the networks they keep alive. For decades, Russia inherited much of this capability from the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, enormous resources were invested in building aircraft capable of performing missions unlike anything found in civilian aviation. Some were designed to patrol vast stretches of ocean in search of submarines. Others became airborne command platforms, extending communication far beyond the reach of ground stations. Many of these aircraft remain in service today, but they also share one important characteristic: most are extremely difficult to replace. Unlike modern fighter aircraft that continue moving through production lines, many of these specialized platforms were designed decades ago. Their factories no longer operate in the same form. Supply chains have changed dramatically. Components often depend on aging industrial networks that cannot simply be restarted whenever replacement is needed. As a result, every operational aircraft becomes more valuable with each passing year. This creates a strategic vulnerability that is very different from losing conventional combat equipment. A damaged tank can often be replaced by another vehicle from storage. An artillery piece can usually be repaired or substituted. But when military relies on a small number of highly specialized platforms performing unique missions, every individual loss has consequences that extend far beyond its replacement cost. One of the most important examples involves long-range communication with strategic naval forces. Ballistic missile submarines are designed to remain hidden for extended periods beneath the ocean's surface. Their survivability depends on remaining undetected, sometimes for months at a time. That same concealment, however, creates an obvious challenge. Maintaining communication with submarines operating hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away has always been one of the most technically demanding problems in military history. Traditional radio signals do not easily penetrate seawater. Throughout the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union invested heavily in specialized communication systems capable of reaching submerged submarines through extremely low-frequency transmissions. These networks combined ground stations with airborne relay platforms, creating redundant channels that could continue operating even during periods of intense conflict. Military planners have long understood that communication itself forms part of nuclear deterrence. Possessing strategic weapons is only one element of deterrence. The ability to reliably transmit orders, maintain command authority, and preserve decision-making under pressure is equally important. Any disruption to those communication networks immediately attracts attention because uncertainty becomes part of the equation. This helps explain why analysts often focus less on individual explosions and more on the facilities where these systems are maintained. Maintenance centers, overhaul facilities, and specialized air bases rarely appear in headlines. Yet they often represent critical nodes supporting much larger military capabilities. Losing a runway can be repaired. Losing experienced technicians, rare equipment, or unique maintenance infrastructure is often far more difficult to reverse. That broader perspective also reveals how the nature of long-range drone operations has evolved. Early in the conflict, drone strikes were frequently viewed as isolated tactical attacks intended to create temporary disruption. Over time, however, the pattern has become more sophisticated. Instead of simply targeting frontline positions, increasing attention has shifted toward infrastructure supporting logistics, aviation, command systems, and industrial capacity. This reflects a wider transformation in military thinking. Rather than attempting to destroy an opponent's entire military force, modern campaigns increasingly seek to identify the small number of systems whose disruption creates disproportionate consequences throughout the larger organization. Military theorists sometimes describe these locations as critical nodes. Remove enough of them, and even a numerically superior force begins experiencing friction across multiple levels of command. Aircraft spend more time waiting for repairs. Spare parts become harder to distribute. Maintenance schedules slip. Operational readiness gradually declines, not because of one catastrophic event, but because dozens of smaller disruptions begin reinforcing one another. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation is economic rather than technological. Throughout much of military history, destroying valuable strategic assets required equally expensive weapons. Today, that equation is changing. Relatively inexpensive unmanned systems can sometimes threaten platforms whose development required decades of research and billions of dollars of investment. This does not mean drones automatically replace traditional military power. Large scale wars still depend on industry, logistics, manpower, and conventional forces, but they do introduce a new layer of strategic uncertainty. Defenders must now protect critical facilities spread across enormous territories, while attackers only need to identify a handful of vulnerable targets capable of producing outsized strategic effects. That changing balance may ultimately become one of the defining military lessons of this conflict, not simply that drones can travel farther than expected, but that modern warfare increasingly rewards precision over mass, disruption over destruction, and carefully selected targets over overwhelming firepower. The consequences become even more significant when viewed through the lens of military planning rather than battlefield tactics. Modern armed forces are built on a simple assumption: critical assets can be protected by distance. Throughout history, air bases, command centers, maintenance facilities, and strategic infrastructure were moved farther away from active combat zones whenever possible. Geography itself became part of the defense system, but long-range drones have begun challenging that assumption. Unlike cruise missiles, which are expensive and relatively scarce, unmanned systems can often be produced in far greater numbers and adapted continuously as defensive measures evolve. They fly lower, present smaller signatures, and force defenders to monitor enormous areas simultaneously. Even when many are intercepted, the defender must remain successful every single time. The attacker only needs a handful to penetrate. That changes the economics of defense. Instead of concentrating resources on protecting forces near the front, militaries now face the challenge of defending infrastructure hundreds or even thousands of kilometers for active combat. Airfields that once seemed comfortably beyond operational reach suddenly require additional surveillance, electronic warfare coverage, point-minus defense systems, and rapid repair capabilities. Every layer added to protect one installation reduces resources available somewhere else. This is why analysts increasingly describe modern drone warfare as a campaign against military efficiency rather than simply military hardware. They damaged aircraft matters. High damaged maintenance center matters even more. When specialized repair facilities experience repeated disruption, the consequences accumulate gradually. Aircraft remain grounded longer. Maintenance cycles become less predictable. Spare parts must travel farther. Highly trained technicians become concentrated at fewer locations, increasing pressure across the entire support network. Unlike dramatic battlefield losses, these problems rarely dominate headlines. Yet over months, they can quietly reduce operational readiness across an entire force. History offers an interesting comparison. During the Second World War, Allied bombing campaigns increasingly shifted away from simply destroying frontline units. Instead, they targeted rail networks, fuel production, transportation hubs, and industrial centers. The objective was not necessarily immediate battlefield victory, but the gradual reduction in an opponent's ability to sustain military operations. Today's long-range drone campaigns appear to follow a similar logic, although executed with entirely different technology. Rather than requiring hundreds of heavy bombers, relatively small unmanned systems can now threaten carefully selected infrastructure with remarkable precision. The objective is often less about spectacular destruction than about forcing continuous disruption, increasing repair costs, and creating uncertainty throughout an opponent's military planning process. That uncertainty extends beyond aviation. Every modern military depends on command and control networks linking sensors, commanders, logistics, intelligence, and operational units into one coordinated system. Satellites, radar installations, communications platforms, and maintenance facilities all contribute to that larger architecture. remove enough individual components, and the overall network begins operating less efficiently even if most of its equipment remains physically intact. Military planners sometimes describe this as attacking the system rather than the platform. Instead of focusing exclusively on destroying individual weapons, attention shifts toward identifying the supporting infrastructure that allows those weapons to function effectively. This represents one of the most important strategic shifts of the 21st century. Future conflicts may increasingly revolve around degrading networks instead of annihilating armies. That possibility is being studied carefully far beyond Eastern Europe. Defense organizations throughout NATO continue expanding investments in autonomous systems, electronic warfare, artificial intelligence, and long-range precision strike capabilities. China has accelerated research into unmanned aircraft operating alongside crewed platforms. Indo-Pacific security planners increasingly examine how distributed drone operations could influence future regional conflicts. Even countries with relatively modest defense budgets are reassessing how inexpensive autonomous technologies might compensate for limitations in conventional military strength. The lesson attracting attention is remarkably consistent. Technological adaptability may now matter as much as industrial scale. That does not mean traditional military power has become irrelevant. Large armies, advanced aircraft, naval forces, and strategic deterrence continue shaping international security. However, they now operate inside an environment where relatively inexpensive technologies can impose disproportionate costs on much larger systems. For Russia, this creates a difficult strategic balancing act. Protecting critical infrastructure requires dispersing valuable assets, strengthening air defenses, expanding surveillance, and maintaining constant readiness across enormous territory. Every adjustment improves security in one location while potentially reducing flexibility somewhere else. Military planners must continuously decide which facilities deserve the highest priority and which risks remain acceptable. Those decisions become increasingly complicated as threats evolve. Every improvement in drone range expands the number of facilities requiring protection. Every advance in autonomous navigation reduces reliance on vulnerable communication links. Every improvement in artificial intelligence increases the ability of unmanned systems to operate under increasingly difficult conditions. This has become an innovation race rather than simply a contest of military inventories. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how quickly adaptation now occurs. During previous generations, major military technologies often required decades before fundamentally changing doctrine. Today, operational lessons emerge almost immediately. Engineers observe battlefield performance, modify hardware or software, distribute updates, and return improved systems to combat within remarkably short periods. The pace of technological evolution has become part of the battlefield itself. That rapid cycle places enormous pressure on traditional military organizations built around long procurement timelines. A platform designed 10 years ago may already require substantial adaptation to remain effective against threats that did not even exist when development first began. The implications extend well beyond this conflict. Future military planning will likely devote increasing attention to resilience rather than simply capability. Building powerful systems remains essential, but ensuring those systems continue functioning after sustained disruption may become equally important. Redundancy, distributed infrastructure, autonomous logistics, and resilient communications are likely to receive far greater emphasis than they did only a decade ago. This may ultimately become one of the defining military lessons of our time. Wars are no longer determined solely by which side possesses the largest inventory of weapons. They are increasingly shaped by which side identifies critical vulnerabilities faster, adapts technology more rapidly, and forces an opponent to spend ever greater resources defending an expanding list of essential infrastructure. Whether that transformation ultimately strengthens deterrence or increases strategic instability remains an open question. History rarely provides immediate answers when entirely new methods of warfare emerge. What seems clear, however, is that modern conflicts are becoming competitions between interconnected systems rather than isolated weapons. Communication networks, maintenance facilities, logistics hubs, autonomous platforms, electronic warfare, artificial intelligence, and precision strike capabilities are no longer supporting elements of military power, they are becoming military power itself. The battlefield is expanding far beyond the front line. It now stretches across industrial capacity, technological innovation, command architecture, and the ability to maintain operational effectiveness under constant pressure. That evolution may prove far more significant than any single strike. Because when future historians look back at this period, they may conclude that the most important revolution was not the arrival of another missile or another aircraft, It was the moment relatively inexpensive autonomous systems demonstrated that carefully selected infrastructure could influence strategic calculations once thought to depend only on the world's largest militaries. And if that assessment proved correct, then the future of warfare will belong not simply to those with the greatest firepower, but to those who understand exactly which connections hold an entire military system together, and how to disrupt them with the smallest possible investment.